I have a suggestion. Why
Like,
don't why don't we do this by email? It's a lot easier.
well,
Okay.
well, 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 well hi Noam, hi Noam Chomsky. Good morning in the USA, and welcome. It is pleasure and honor to have you with us. Noam Chomsky is one of the most important philosophers, biolinguists, and activists for peace and human rights, justice, and freedom in the world. Has been an activist for more 18 years when you wrote in American press against fascists in Spain. Well, now, uh, and the three fundamental questions for humanity today are first, the climate emergency. Second, the danger of nuclear wars. And third, the increasing deterioration of democracy in the world. Well, what can you tell us about them? Noam, please.
Well, we last week we got the most recent of the IPCC reports, International Commission of Scientists who, under the United Nations auspices, who give their assessment of the climate. It was the most dire warning we have yet received. Each one has been more threatening than the last. This is basically saying we are essentially at the decision point. We will either eliminate fossil fuels within the next few years, or else life on Earth will become unlivable. We, we will reach points, so called tipping points, where the changes become irreversible. Doesn't mean everyone's going to die tomorrow, but it means processes will be put in place that are irreversible. They'll just keep going by themselves unless there's some amazing new technological development, which nobody can dream of. We'll be facing essentially the destruction of organized human life on Earth. And that has to be settled within a few years, a decade, 2 decades. If you look around the world, it's becoming very dire. So take Brazil. It's been predicted for a long time that as events are moving on their present course, the Amazon will sooner or later shift from being what's called a carbon sink, which absorbs massive amounts of carbon from the atmosphere, into a carbon emitter. Well, just a few weeks ago, a study by Brazilian scientists found that that's already happening for a corner of the Amazon, and it will continue thanks to extension of mining, agriculture interests, illegal deforestation under the ultra right government, which doesn't care, just wants to make money for its rich uh, contributors. Well, that's a disaster for Brazil, but also for the world. That's one of the main uh, systems in the world that removes carbon from the atmosphere. If it begins to produce carbon into the atmosphere, that sharply accelerates the threat of environmental destruction. And this is happening everywhere. We see signs of it everywhere, but the danger is enormous and virtually nothing is being done about it. There are we are going to have COP26, an international meeting in Glasgow in late October. But unless very strong decisions are made at that point, we are very likely heading into a catastrophic future. Now, that means that massive public efforts must be made within the next few weeks to compel governments to take quite strong measures. That won't be easy. There's hardly a single one that's doing it. Nuclear war, the threat is significantly increasing. Trump basically dismantled the arms control regime, which had put some limits on advancing the war. There are new threats of destruction. New weapons are being created that are more, you can see what my dogs think about it, that are more.
The dog.
That's the proof. The new weapons are being developed, which are more destructive, more threatening. The actions are being taken, which are highly provocative, sending a naval armada into the South China Sea, provocative actions on the Russian border. If you simply look at expenditures, the latest figures we have are from 2020. The United States spent about close to $790 billion on military spending. Second is China, about a third that much, maybe 260 billion. Fourth place behind India is Russia at about 70 billion. All of these are funds that are desperately needed for other purposes, like steps to mitigate and reverse environmental destruction, and they are being wasted on means to destroy all of us more quickly. That's the nature of the political leadership of the major states. The United States is, of course, driving it. You can tell from the figures, and they underestimate the issue. Of all the major countries, the United States is the only one that faces no threats. The US talks about threats, but the threats are at the Chinese border. They're not at the US border. The United States is not surrounded by Chinese military bases with missiles, nuclear-tipped missiles aimed at the United States. It's the other way around, okay? But that's in the United States called a threat, okay? There's only one way in which this suicide pact that the human race is involved in, there's only one way that can be stopped. That's by popular mass protest and action. And that requires forms in which it can be expressed and articulated, democratic forms. And as democratic systems erode throughout the world, moving towards more autocracy, central control, pressures, it diminishes the options with which we can face these problems. Just take the United States again. It's almost certain that next year, the Republicans will come back into office by one means or another. A restriction on voting, a variety of other devices. The strategy is to make sure that the Biden administration cannot carry out any programs that would benefit the population. Okay, that makes sense from their point of view. Then there'll be anger, resentment. People will be opposed to the government. They'll vote the Republicans back into power. at which point the Republican elites, the people that run the party, will turn to their programs of total slavish servility to corporate power and the very rich. Destroy the environment if you can make more profit. Build more arms because it's good for military industry. So we're finished. They have a voting base which has been whipped up into a frenzy of hysterical lunacy. If you look at the poll results on Republicans, it's hard to believe. I mean, about a quarter, 70% of Republicans think the election was stolen, that Trump won. Insane. Over a third of Republicans think that China developed the virus as a bioweapon to destroy Americans. About a quarter of Republicans think that the country is run by a group of sadistic pedophiles who are engaged in murder of children, sexual assaults on children. It's insane, and it's growing. So what you have is a leadership dedicated to the service of extreme wealth and corporate power, and a popular base which is basically proto-fascist and whipped into madness on crazy issues. Take a look at the map. Every day in the New York Times, major newspaper, there's a map which shows where COVID cases are increasing, and they are increasing. It's the Confederacy. Take a look at it. It's the Southeast United States, essentially the old Confederacy, now all Republican because they switched from Democrat to Republican when Richard Nixon developed his Southern strategy. If Democrats are going to support civil rights, we can be the racist party. The party of racism and white supremacy can pick up the Southern vote. So that's now they're opposed to vaccinations. They won't permit measures. They're, in fact, punishing measures which would help people protect themselves and others by just getting vaccinated or wearing masks. So what you see is, of course, an enormous rise in COVID cases, hospitals overwhelmed, but people are literally on their deathbeds saying there's no COVID crisis. It's a hoax. Okay, that's the popular base. About probably half of Republicans think the democratic system should be eliminated because it's going to bring the wrong people into voting, people who aren't pure white, whatever that means. We have to maintain white supremacy by force if necessary. Okay, that's the popular base. The elites are totally shameless, dedicated to destruction if you can make profit. That's what we're heading into. Other countries are not very great, but that's the United States. The Trump administration did have a geostrategic program, which is still pretty much in operation. The program was to create a reactionary international of the world's most reactionary states, harshest dictatorships, run from Washington. The Western Hemisphere would include the most important country, Brazil, Bolsonaro's Brazil, which is proto-fascist. In the East, it would include Modi's India. Modi is busy at work dismantling Indian secular democracy, creating a Hindu ethnocracy, kind of a counterpart to white supremacy in the United States. in the Middle East, it was formalized in the so-called Abraham Accords, which brought together the most brutal reactionary dictatorships, the dictatorships of the Gulf, Morocco, another dictatorship. Egypt is already a member, basically a member, the harshest, brutal dictatorship in Egyptian history. Israel, which is moving very far to the right, provides a technological base and military security base. That's the base in Europe. In the Middle East, in Europe, it's places like Hungary under Orban, now a darling of the Republican Party, destroying Hungarian democracy will spread. That's the parallel to the moves towards destruction of the environment and racing towards nuclear destruction. That's where we're heading. And it's not inevitable. For all of these problems, there are answers and feasible answers, but they have to be implemented. And the only way they're going to be implemented is by really mass popular action. It's had some effect. Can't deny it. It's very, very important. So in the United States, it's at least had the effect of forcing the government to adopt on paper, sensible climate policies. There were even resolutions in Congress advocating them. That's a major step, but it's not the step to implementation. That's missing everywhere. And that has to be overcome, and quickly, on all of these issues, or else the species is essentially doomed. Not just us, but we're destroying other species at an incredible rate, a rate that hasn't been seen for literally 65 million years. Well, that's us. You could argue that it would be a benefit to the world if the human species eliminated itself quickly. At least other species could survive. That's what it would look like to an extraterrestrial observer if one were there.
Now I introduce to you my friends Roman Gil and Cesar Cobos.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm sorry I came late. I thought we were going to start at 8 Spanish time. So an honor to be with all of you.
Sorry. I can't hear you.
Roman, abre el micrófono.
Can you hear now?
Yeah.
Oh, now,
yes. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
It's a great honor to be with you, Professor Chomsky. We have all been reading, and you have been an inspiration to many of us for many years. So it's really, really great honor. But not just an honor, we are very interested in your ideas. What you have been saying so far is, I find, extremely worrisome and at the same time very lucid. We have some questions, of course. You said it's reversible. It's not inevitable, the doom in so many perspectives. You have been talking about the United States, but there are other parts in the world. But of course, we also have Latin America, Africa, Asia, China. Your view, how can we do better? Or is there any chance, or are we definitely doomed? And if we can do something, what can civil society do? What do you think it's feasible?
Well, it's extremely important now for the global South, including all the areas you mentioned, to become unified, active, have a major role and voice in global affairs. We can see that on every issue that confronts us. Take environment, climate change. If the global south does not, it's now producing probably about half of emissions. If that is not overcome, wouldn't even matter if the major countries, if the richer countries did cut back emissions. That has to be done throughout the global south. Now, that cannot be done without substantial aid from the rich countries. They have already promised it, but they haven't delivered it. They have a deep responsibility. One reason is just it's a matter of survival. The other reason is it's the rich European countries and their American offshoot who are responsible for this catastrophe. We talk about global warming as if somehow the human species did it. No, it's first of all the rich countries who did it, and secondly, the rich within the rich countries who are responsible for this. Poor people in the United States contribute very little. It's the rich in the rich countries who are destroying the world, okay, and have been doing it for centuries. I don't have to run through European history for you and the history of Europe and the global south. Massive genocide, robbery, torture, one horror after another. It's kind of interesting in the United States now to hear the talk about ending forever wars. When did the forever wars start in what's now the United States? 500 years ago, when Columbus arrived and initiated the process of destruction and robbery of hundreds of millions of people. 1763, the United States was formed and took over the process of extermination, genocide, and robbery. The United States there hardly been a single year in which the United States has not been at war. Throughout, as soon as the British were kicked out, the United States, the new United States, 1783, immediately embarked on aggressive wars against the Indian nations that had been constrained by the British. Strait was gone, went right through the 19th century. Extermination, expulsion, terror, violence, robbery of half of Mexico, robbery of Hawaii from its inhabitants. Then you get to the 20th century, massive invasion of the Philippines, killing a couple 100,000 people, interventions everywhere, never stop. There are changes. 1962, Kennedy made a very important move. He changed the mission of the Latin American military, which is run by the United States. He changed their mission from hemispheric defense, which was meaningless, to internal security, which means a war against the population. That set off a plague of repression through Latin America, worst in its history since the conquistadors, began with the military dictatorship in Brazil, swept through the hemisphere, by the 1980s reached Central America with Reagan's terrorist wars, killed a couple 100,000 people, destroyed the countries, resonates right until the present with people still fleeing from the wreckage to the American border where they're driven back. That's the United States. Europe and Africa, it's worse. So how does Europe react? If people are fleeing from the wreckage of European violence in Africa, what you do is make sure that they drown in the Mediterranean. That's Europe today. Either make them drown in the Mediterranean or drive them back into deeper poverty in Africa. Okay. You may recall that Mahatma Gandhi once was asked what he thought about Western civilization, and he said he thought it might be a good idea. Well, we can reflect on that. But going back to the question, with regard to the environment, the global south has a major role to play, and those who are responsible for the disaster, the rich in the rich countries, must stand up, meet their responsibility, fund the measures that are necessary to allow the global south to take a primary role in meeting this global problem. With regard to nuclear war, what the global south can do and has done is press hard for an end to nuclear weapons. There is now a treaty in force, 122 countries under the United Nations, a treaty banning the use or production of nuclear weapons, primarily pressed by the global south. The nuclear states have not joined it, but they can be compelled to join it by a combination of pressure from inside in solidarity with the movements of the global south that want to survive. There are even lesser measures that can be taken that are very important. So one of the danger spots, major danger spots, is the Middle East, where the United States, almost alone in the world, claims, along with Israel, claims that Iranian nuclear programs are a major threat to world peace. And nobody else believes that, but it's a US-Israeli obsession, and that is laying the basis for a possible major war. The very easy solution, which has been pressed by the global south, establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. Everyone's in favor of it. The Arab states, Iran, the global south, Europe's not opposed. That would end any possible threat of, even if you think there is one, of Iranian nuclear programs. So what stops it? The United States vetoes it every time it comes up for a very simple reason. They don't want Israeli nuclear weapons to be inspected. Okay? The global south can do quite a lot about that. It's a voice. It doesn't have the arms, but it has a voice. And it can join in solidarity with Americans to overcome this barrier. Incidentally, it's not the only one. There is a nuclear weapons-free zone in Africa, but it can't be implemented. It can't be implemented because the British reject international law, reject the judgment of the World Court in the United Nations, and insist on holding the island of Diego Garcia, which is part of Africa. And they insist on it because Britain is basically what's called the poodle of the United States, follows US orders. And the US has ordered Britain to hold on to the island, throw out all the inhabitants, so the US can establish a major military base on Diego Garcia, which under Obama was raised to nuclear capacity. That prevents Africa from implementing its nuclear weapons-free zone. And that's not just symbolic. The Diego Garcia base is used by the United States regularly to bomb Central Asia and the Middle East. Well, that's Africa. There's also supposed to be a Pacific nuclear weapons-free zone. can't be implemented. Why? The United States insists on nuclear facilities in its Pacific islands. Well, here again, the global South can become a major voice in world affairs. Actually, there were steps towards that under the Lula government in Brazil early in this century, before it was thrown out in a coup. Lula was leading the way for the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, to become an important voice in world affairs, and it was having an impact. G77, the now 130 or so countries, is an organization, and it can become more vocal, more significant. Well, that's the environment and nuclear weapons. It's more than that. Well, take the current pandemic. Everyone knows what's going on. It's horrifying. The rich countries are monopolizing the vaccines. They are insisting on protecting the exorbitant patent rights of the super rich pharmaceutical corporations in radical violation of free trade. They're insisting on that. The result is the global South is not getting vaccines. That's deeply immoral. It means huge numbers of people will die, and it's also suicidal for the West. And everyone knows exactly why. It gives time for the virus to mutate, just as the Delta virus appeared in India. New variants will appear. Sooner or later, they might be vaccine resistant. They'll spread to the West. It'll be massive destruction. But for Western civilization, such as it is, it's more important to preserve the profits of the rich pharmaceutical corporations and to monopolize the vaccines. That's more important than survival. Okay? That's the state of Western civilization today. We know what the state of it has been in past years. Gandhi understood perfectly well. Well, here the global South happens to be the victims, but they should also be an organized force calling for reversal of these destructive, immoral, suicidal policies. So what's the goal of the global South? Potentially enormous, but the potential has to be realized.
Well, Pastora Martinez.
Yeah, good afternoon. Good to see you all. Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. It's a pleasure to be here. Antonio, I don't know, sorry, because I answered a bit late. You want me to introduce myself or?
Sure.
No, we have Professor Chomsky
sorry.
because there was a mistake. No, there was a mistake with the time, so some people have joined late. I want to share with you that we have invited people from different areas, including large companies. For example, Maria is in the board of a company of energy, so I think it's her conversation with you would be interesting. We have also people from the press, from the universities, from development in public services. So what we expect is some conversation with you because they are all extremely interested in your work and in your view. And I suggest, as you have been arguing how big companies are really plundering and damaging the world badly and leading us to a sort of disaster, I like Maria to say something because she's part of the board of an important energy company, and she's worried about those things, and perhaps she should have something to say. I'm not saying to defend, but to give a view on that.
Okay.
Okay, Maria.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Chomsky, for hosting us. Indeed, your thoughts on the climate emergency are quite enlightening. Although I would like to hear your views on the. We know where the responsibilities from the past rely, but looking forward, what are the prospects for the next conference of the parties to be held in Britain? The compromise or the commitments announced by the new US administration, China. At the end of the day, we have a community of nearly 200 countries in this UN framework convention, but just 5 countries emit 3/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. How do you see the global process versus perhaps a dialogue between 5 countries that are crucial for the prospects of the world to meet their climate targets?
It's up to people like you. As I said, there's going to be a meeting in Glasgow of almost all the countries of the world this October, COP26. They're going to be dealing with the climate crisis. There is the Treaty for the Prevention of Production of Nuclear Weapons. It is in force. 122 countries, mostly the South. The institutions are there, but they have to do something. And the leadership isn't going to. You can't expect the leadership, maybe nice people, but in the institutional framework in which they function, they're not going to do anything unless they are pressed by massive public opinion. That means demonstrations, protests, takeover of offices, whatever the right measures are, to compel them to change their policies. Now they are reacting. So the energy corporations, the big banks, now understand that they're in trouble unless they pretend, and I stress pretend, to be doing something about the climate crisis. So they now have this exciting new development of ESG, environment, sustainability, governability, and they're all going to become wonderful citizens dedicated to the common good. They're going to forget about profits and all those bad things. You hear lovely rhetoric from the head of ExxonMobil and everyone else. Then you look at the programs. More fossil fuels. The program is what's called greenwashing. The actual programs are increased fossil fuel production, increased profit, but say that we're really with you. We're going to work on techniques to remove from the air the poisons that we're pouring into it, which maybe someday in the far future may actually do something. But the Biden administration is not very different. They have on paper a pretty good program, forced on them by pressure from popular groups, mostly young people, like Sunrise Movement, who went to the extent of sitting in on congressional offices, taking them over and demanding action. So there is action on paper. Now take a look at the facts. Monday, about 10 days ago, the IPCC came out with its latest report, which you've all seen. Tuesday, the next day, 1 day later, President Biden appealed to OPEC to raise oil production of petroleum, increase production. Why? Because that'll reduce gas prices in the United States, and that will help his electoral prospects. That's action. On the one side, there's talk. On the other side, there's action. And the popular movements have to be very clear on not accepting nice rhetoric, but demanding implementation of it. And there isn't much time. We know what has to be done. It's not a secret. International Energy Agency, which originally used to work for the fossil fuel companies. The International Energy Agency has come out with explicit programs, careful, detailed programs, which would bring the climate crisis under control. Very good reason to believe that it would, and they're feasible with a few percentage of gross domestic product. Actually less in the United States, less than has been used to bail out the financial institutions after the crisis they faced with COVID, less than that. Not beyond reach by any means. And such programs, similar program, is already on the floor of Congress, but as words. And to carry it from words to implementation is the urgent task of popular movements. Right now, before the Glasgow conference, and afterwards to make sure whatever promises are made will be implemented. The major task that's the greatest challenge that popular movements have ever faced. And it has to be carried out, it has to be implemented, or else we're basically going to face real catastrophe. Something similar is true on nuclear war. As I said, the global south can take a strong and effective stance on, at the very least, instituting nuclear weapons-free zones around the world, in the Middle East, in Africa, in the Pacific, can be done, and in joining in solidarity with movements in the rich countries and the nuclear states to force them to accept their legal responsibility under the Non-Proliferation Treaty of making good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. All of that is feasible. You know, reconstruction of democracy is of course feasible. It's going to take a lot of work.
And Cesar Cobos, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chomsky. Professor. Good morning. My question is about the COVID problem. And I think we need a strategy. And I agree with you that bringing vaccine to all the world is something good, something we should do. But to free the patent wouldn't slow down the next virus vaccine. Don't you think that if we free the patent and we stop the companies to make themselves rich after what they have done, it could slow down the investigation for the next virus?
That's the claim of the pharmaceutical corporations, but I think it collapses on inspection. So take, say, the Moderna vaccine. It was almost totally funded by the government. The major work was done in government laboratories. That's where the major discoveries were made. The development process was mostly taxpayer funded. Now that generalizes pretty widely. If you take a look at the way the whole economy works, not just the drug system, it's pretty much a system of public subsidy, private profit. So take what we're now using, computers, internet, satellites. Where'd that come from? Almost entirely the public. Came from decades of research within the public sector, either in government laboratories, in universities like my university, MIT, which is mostly government funded, doing decades of innovative, risky research. Finally got to the point where you could sell a computer, then the private companies come in, Apple, Microsoft, and develop the products further so that they can be marketable and profitable. It's not 100% the case, but it's substantially the case. And it's pretty much the same with the drug companies. A lot of the basic research, you take a look at MIT, main research university in the world, where I spent most of my life. You just walk around the neighborhood, look at the buildings right around MIT. They're very instructive. In the 50s and the 60s, it was electronics companies, Raytheon, iTech, major electronic companies. Why are they hanging around MIT? So they can pick up the research that's being done in the research laboratories of the major research institutions in the world and use it for marketing and profit. Walk around MIT today, Kendall Square. Who do you see? Novartis, Pfizer, Genentech, genetic engineering and pharmaceutical corporations. Same reason. They can rip off the research that's being done under government auspices in the major research institution and adapt it for development and profit. Take a look at every other major research university in the United States. Stanford, North Carolina, same story. It's not accidental. Now, it's not that the private corporations don't do anything. They have great laboratories. Pfizer has wonderful laboratories. They do excellent work. But quite a lot is done through taxpayer initiative over long periods. Now, that can be extended. So the NIH, National Institute of Health, is barred by law from carrying out the testing of pharmaceuticals it develops. It could do it. They don't have to put it in the hands of private enterprise. They could perfectly well do that. But the laws are designed to make sure that private corporations get exorbitant profits. Now, their plea is, well, if we don't have exorbitant profits, how are we going to create new drugs? Well, by doing it the way it's pretty much always been done, but more so through public initiatives in the public sector. If you want to continue with adaptation to markets, and fine, you can do that. But there's no reason why the public sector can't be expanded to carry out work well beyond the basic fundamental research that is mostly assigned to the public sector. So, this is not, pharmaceutical industry is kind of an extreme example because lives depend on it, but it extends to pretty much the whole system. Furthermore, this goes way back in history. It's not so you go back to the 19th century, there was something called the American system of production, which amazed the world. Mass production developed with quality control, interchangeable parts, high efficiency, and so on. Where was it developed? In government armories. And the railroads were the big innovative system in the 19th century, the ones that created the economy going forward. They were too complicated to be run by private industry. So they were run by the Army Corps of Engineers. This happens over and over, and it makes good sense. Why should private industry take risks? They don't want to do that. They want to make profit. That's their nature. It's not a criticism. And the nature of a private corporation is make profit, not take risks. If they're going to be risks, somebody else ought to take them, the public. That's a very natural characteristic of state capitalist societies. Again, I'm not criticizing the people, they're just following their institutional necessities. That's the way the institutions are set up. If you're Apple computers, you don't want to take risks. You want to make profit. So by now, I take Apple, very interesting one, the biggest corporation in the world. Turns out you can make more profit by financial manipulations than by developing new products. So if you look at what's happening with Apple, they're reducing funding in R&D under Tom Cook and increasing funding in financial speculation. They shift their offices to Ireland so they don't have to pay taxes. They have production done in China, run by Foxconn, Taiwanese corporation, and Apple basically enriches itself through rent, through what economists call rent. They have the design, they develop the basic product after the research was done in the public sector. Now they sit back and collect rent, investing in financial manipulations, which are mostly harmful to the economy. It's not a criticism of Tom Cook. He's doing his job. His job is to enrich Apple. Okay, that's the way you do it. I think there are fundamental problems we're raising at this point about the nature of our fundamental economic institutions. But going back to the plea of Big Pharma, I don't think it's sustainable. I mean, I don't ask you to take my word for it. There's been detailed research on this. The main person who's done it is a very good economist, Dean Baker, done extensive research on how the public sector could expand its innovation and production in the pharmaceutical industry. And I think it's pretty convincing work. You can actually pick it up from a book he has online free. It's called Rigged, how the whole system is rigged against the public. And it's an online publication. But at least these are things that should be looked into. He has argued, I think, pretty convincingly that the whole patent system is pretty much of a ripoff. There are better ways we do need, of course, what the patent system was set up for, a method of stimulating innovation, invention, creativity, and so on. But I think there's a pretty good argument that that's not a good system for it. And if you look over history, that's pretty much the way it's worked. There are countries that never accepted the patent system, like Switzerland, which were very effective in research and development. In fact, the modern patent system under the World Trade Organization, Uruguay round, is far more extreme than anything that existed in history. First of all, patents are much longer. Secondly, they are process patents, not just product patents. That's new. That means that Pfizer can patent the method of production, not just the product. That prevents others in India, South Africa, Brazil, places where there are major pharmaceutical industries, prevents them from using the process and improving it. They're smart people. They can make innovations themselves and improve the product, the process, but they can't if they don't have access to it. So the whole system set up by the World Trade Organization, basically dictated by a few rich countries, has, I think, seriously undermined innovation and development with highly exorbitant patent regime, which I don't think have any justification, certainly are radically in violation of free market principles. Well, I think those are all things to think about. We're not going to get an answer today, but I think they should be they should be on the table to think about. And there's lots of directions to move.
Thank you, Professor. I think Teresa Martinez wished to address Professor Chomsky.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave for another appointment. Life works.
Oh, Teresa, are you there?
Pastora, yeah.
Sorry, it was Pastora. Sorry.
It's fine. Sorry.
Pastora Martinez.
Thank you. So thanks again a lot, Professor Chomsky. And continuing with the academia, I'm vice president from the Open University of Catalonia. And you were talking about research and innovation, but also concerning what can be done from academia, and particularly from the Western academia, in the terms of raising this massive public opinion, and also how can we foster also this global South opinion pressure in order to make them be heard, or at least to make bigger the pressure. The problem we have is that we do know what we can do, but the problem is that the universities as institutions, we are very, very slow in order to make those changes, and also we are not that effective in order to create that mobilization of the young people that we are educating. And in fact, Fridays for Future grown beside the universities, at least here in Spain. So what can you think we can do as universities and university leaders in order to create this massive public opinion to be heard by the others? Thank you very much.
Well, I don't think universities are that small. They're major institutions. They are the core, they're the place where ideas are developed in many areas, where technology is developed, where research is carried out. They also produce the people who will carry all of these things forward. The students of today are the researchers, leaders, scholars of tomorrow. And that's an enormous part of the population. Much smaller groups than universities have had a major effect in changing ideas radically. Take a very striking example: Austrian economics, what's called neoliberalism. Very small group formed the Mount Pelerin Society back in the 1940s. Determined to get their ultra-right free market ideas into the mainstream. Well, the first place they could try it was Chile under Pinochet. They enthusiastically raced in, loved everything that was happening, all the torture, the massacres, it was all marvelous. It was a perfect experimental condition for neoliberal ideas. Nobody could object. Torture chambers took care of that. International financial institutions loved it, poured money in. United States poured money in. They were smart enough to maintain the core of the economy, which was a highly efficient nationalized copper company, Codelco. So the ideologues of Chicago decided, well, we better keep that. It's the core of the economy. So it was perfect experimental conditions. In 5 years, they had succeeded in totally crashing the economy. The government had to take it over. And more of the economy was run by the government than under Allende. That was the first success. But they didn't care, because by then they were on to a bigger success, taking over the world. That's Reagan and Thatcher. By then they were in a position to apply these principles to the whole world. That's a real triumph coming from a small group of people whose ideas were triumphant. We have been suffering under this plague for the last 40 years. Don't have time to go through the details, but you know them. Well, of course, that wasn't just ideas in their case. They had plenty of power behind them. They had the power of concentrated wealth and state power. We don't have that, but nevertheless, universities can be the source of ideas, of organization, of solidarity, joint operations of Western and Global South universities can be very effective. I spent a lot of time talking to students in the Global South. Now that we have these technologies available, plenty of others can do it. Joint projects, joint activities. I think that can spread very effectively. In fact, student groups over history have often been in the forefront of major social changes. And there's a reason for that. Students are at an age when they're the most free that they're ever going to be in their lives. They're out of parental control. They're not yet in the situation where they have to put food on the table. They have a degree of freedom to think, to act with the assistance of an enlightened faculty and do important things. Well, universities don't run the world, but I think they can have a major impact. And I'm really sorry, but I have another appointment coming up. I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave.
Professor Chomsky, thank you very much. There was just one expert in international taxation that wanted to put you a very brief question. Could we abuse for 1 minute, very briefly, that very last question? So Pepe Scario.
Hello, Professor. It's really enriching to listening to you. I'm sorry you cannot see me. It's a question of connection because I am in the countryside and I don't know what happens with the camera. Just I would like to ask you about the green issue, which is, I think, one of the most important at the moment. I am working for a foundation in Latin America to promote relations between Latin America and Europe, and we are very interested in as Europeans to I would say export, which is not the correct word, the European Green Deal, but I would say how can we make the developing countries as ambitious as our countries in the climate change goals? We have the funding, we have the regulatory power, what Anu Bradford calls the Russell effects, but we see that some Latin American countries are very fossil fuel dependent. And how would you give us an advice in this field? Thank you very much.
Well, for countries that are fossil fuel dependent, it's a very serious problem. The countries that are fossil fuel dependent are, of course, going to destroy themselves very quickly, destroy the world with them. But they can't overcome the problem by themselves. At least most of them can't. Some actually could. So Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, they have the resources and even the climate to move very quickly towards renewable energy. After all, these are places where the sun's shining all the time. Huge resources which they're wasting on armaments, wars, enriching the owners, and so on. But they got plenty of resources to move towards renewable energy. A place like Iraq could have done it, but not after the wreckage that was caused by the US invasion. They're in a desperate situation. So they need massive assistance to move towards sustainable energy and quickly. And again, they're in a position to do it. Other countries, it's going to be harder and they'll need assistance from the rich. But individually, there's lots that they can do. Take Brazil. Brazil is, or take Venezuela, which is an interesting case. Venezuela was turned into a petro colony by the United States 100 years ago when oil was discovered. Venezuela had been a British colony, but when oil was discovered, it became the basis of the economy. The United States kicked the British out and took Venezuela over and essentially turned it into a petro colony. And so it remains. The Chavez government, when it came in, did a lot of things, but one of its major errors was not to diversify the economy. It kept the base as a petro base. It doesn't have to be done. Venezuela has potentially rich agricultural resources, industrial resources, but it's easier to sell the oil, sometimes called the resource curse. But these are changing. By now, it would be very hard to change it, but it could be done. And it has to be done with assistance from the rich countries, not by the rich countries. So the United States is determined to get back its Venezuelan colony, and it is using even such measures as piracy in the high seas, considered for centuries a horrible offense. The U.S. is now carrying it out to strangle Venezuela. Okay, all of that has to change. Plenty wrong in Venezuela, but it does not help by crushing the population with sanctions, piracy, and blockades. Not that. So yes, Venezuela can be helped to eliminate the resource curse, reliance on oil that was instituted by the United States a century ago. Each country has its own problems, but I don't think there are any where the problems are literally unsolvable. They're serious. They have to be dealt with, just as internal to the United States. The problems of coal country have to be dealt with. Take West Virginia, major coal producing state. You can't just go to West Virginia and say, close the coal mines and starve. That's not a policy. What you can do is go to West Virginia and say, look, you have to close the coal mines or we're all going to be dead and your communities will be ruined. And here's a way you can proceed with better jobs, better work, better communities. Here's the options. Let's work on them. Actually, that's being done. And the coal miner unions are now becoming interested in it. So that's the kind of thing that you can be sure that in the US, the Republicans will block every effort to do that because they want people to suffer so that they'll be able to get back into power. But they don't have to win. you can move ahead and pursue these policies. So, hard job, not impossible. But it's local. Every place you look, the problems are different. They're different in West Virginia and Iraq, not the same problem. Same general problem, but different ways of dealing with it. There's no general universal formula, just local solutions that have to be carried out for the same long-term goal. Same long-term project should be done with international solidarity. That's by far the best way to achieve it. I really do have
You have to go. Thank you very, very much, Professor Chomsky, for your generosity. I'm sure many people will enjoy watching and learning from your ideas. Thank you. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Gracias, Tibi. Gracias, Tibi Ago Bobis. Gracias, Tibi Noam Chomsky. In lingua latina loquor. I speak only a little Spanish. Thanks very much for your conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.